Hello, welcome to the third of the Brandeis University Schusterman Center for Israel Studies Summer Webinar Series. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center, and today's program is entitled Hotel Corona, Exploring Unexpected Directions in Contemporary Israeli Music. Before turning this program over to my colleague, Dr. Shayna Weiss, let me explain that there will be time for questions. Please write any questions you may have in the chat feature at the very bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the program. I'll be back later with your questions. For now, please welcome Dr. Shayna Weiss and Professor Mark Kligman.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in today, and especially our special guest, Professor Mark Kligman. I'm just going to introduce him with a short bio, although his accomplishments are much longer than this. He is a professor of Ethnomusicology and Musicology at UCLA at the Herb Alpert School of Music. He specializes in liturgical traditions of Middle Eastern Jewish communities and other areas of popular Jewish music. He's published about Syrian Jews in Brooklyn and their music. His book, Maqām and Liturgy, The Ritual, Music, and Aesthetics of Syrian Jews in Brooklyn, was a notable selection by the Association for Jewish Studies Schnitzer Book Award. He is also a walking encyclopedia, I would say, on all things Jewish and Israeli music. He is the academic chair of the Jewish Music Forum, the co-editor of the journal Musica Judaica, and he is the holder of the Mickey Katz Endowed Chair in Jewish Music at UCLA and director of the Lowell Milken Fund for American Jewish Music. He also is a beloved instructor in our Summer Institute for Israel Studies, where he teaches our fellows all about Israeli music. So to start, Mark, obviously, this is something that you teach entire courses on, but if you wanted to give everyone who tuned in sort of on one foot what they need to understand about Israeli music today, what would you talk about to give them a sense of the landscape and the trends? And Mark, you're on mute, so just remember to please unmute yourself. Great.
Good morning. It's great to be here, and I love all the things that the Schusterman Center program does. And 3 years ago, I was a fellow, and it was an extraordinary experience. And I'm so happy to be with you and to learn and to share my experiences. To answer your question, the one simple thing is how incredibly dynamic Israeli music is. As Israeli culture is rich and diverse and explores new boundaries of identity and influences, that's clearly reflected in the music, and really excited to share with you what we've prepared to discuss today to really demonstrate those unique aspects of recent changes in Israeli music. Shayna, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you having, yeah.
Okay, I don't know if I froze for a second, but.
Oh, okay.
Were you able to hear me?
We are with you. We are with you. Please
Okay.
Continue.
So shall we begin what we were going to prepare to talk about?
So yes, please share.
Okay. So our thought about today's presentation is to really focus on this wonderful and interesting experience that was dubbed Hotel Corona, a hotel in Yerushalayim was suddenly beset with people who were diagnosed with corona, who all had to shelter in place, and it really was a real cross-section of Israel. And the unexpected things happened were that Israelis, Palestinians, Jews and Arabs all interacted in a very unique way for this, and during this particular period of time in April and May, and this was a featured story in NPR. And it's a real metaphor for what that unique set of encounters of Israeli music is. When I look at Israeli music, I always want to have in mind three considerations. And that is that there are three dynamics that are always ongoing, where there's always a negotiation between secular and sacred culture in Israel, between East and West, the Sephardi and Mizrahi heritage and Ashkenazi heritage, as well as the past and the present. And if we were to sort of plot this visually on a spectrum, these three different elements, we're always seeing how there's just this constant negotiation. It's never sitting in one place, it's negotiating between these different realms. So we're going to focus today on some unique aspects of Sephardi Mizrahi heritage. And just to set us within the scene, I think the important thing is to really show the trajectory of Jews in the Mediterranean regions, that many came to Israel in very sort of large communities in the first half of the 19th century. And also, of course, many went to Europe, they came to America, they went to other places, but this is just a very sort of brief visualization of that. When we look at trying to define in the academic sense a definition of Sephardi Mizrahi heritage, we usually say that Sephardi Jewry is Jews from Spain and their descendants in various areas of relocation. Mizrahi has sort of become a synonymous term, and I think perhaps in America and in academia, we use those terms Sephardi Mizrahi interchangeably. And Sephardi may refer to, for some, a more religious identity, or Jews from Spain call themselves Sephardi Tahor. And those identity markers are often very fluid. And as we know in anthropology, who gets to put those labels on people? You know, is it a demographic term, an academic term? Internal terms, people use different identities. They may say, I'm Sephardi, I'm Mizrahi. They may say, I'm from Syria, I'm from, you know, maybe Aleppo, I'm from Morocco. So these are very fluid terms, but we're dealing with clearly a different region than the European experience. The study of Mizrahi music is a more recent area of study, and this book by Amy Horowitz really shares with us how there's this sort of pan-ethnic style. Mizrahi music is not just one thing. It's a real interesting dynamic of a confluence of sometimes different lyrics, but certainly many different musical styles. Some of the early styles in Israel were Greek music styles and Turkish and Arabic styles, and now different forms of Arabic music are informing, whether it's Egyptian or Yemenite, and it's a very fluid and very dynamic musical world. And the important thing to remember is how the Mizrahi community really struggled getting recognition in Israeli culture. This is a much larger topic, but in terms of music, it's music that really emerged out of particular social context. People were playing this music at weddings and bar mitzvahs. It wasn't really recorded through a music industry or promoted onto the radio until really much later in Israel's history, at least into the 1990s. And just to give this a very quick context, we talk about Shirei Eretz Yisrael, the songs of the land of Israel, as being very formative when Israel becomes a state, which sort of becomes sort of the very Zionistic patriotic songs of Israel. Israeli rock comes in the 1970s, and that music starts to change the messages. A lot of it is about experiences that predominantly men had, and then later women, in Israeli armed forces, and these develops different critiques of Israel, but it's more told from a personal rather than a Zionistic experience. And then finally, Musica Mizrahit becomes more fully developed and accepted in the 1990s. And what's interesting today is how these three separate chronological categories sort of all come together in sort of one particular label that we just generally call Israeli music, but yet there are many different trends and many different styles. Is there anything you wanted to comment on this, Shayna?
No, but thank you for like sort of just showing us, you know, obviously we could talk about this a lot longer, but showing us these like three constellations that say what we have to think about. And I know when you and I were talking, we were thinking of artists that signified right, these trends and these changes, and we thought of one really interesting example. Do you want to talk a bit about Dudu Tassa and his project and sort of illustrate to us how his music exemplifies all these trends?
Sure. So Dudu Tassa is a younger Israeli artist. I guess anyone younger than me is younger. And he was born in 1977, and he was born in Tel Aviv, and he came from an Iraqi Jewish family. And he really came to prominence in Israel as a rock star, as a composer, as a songwriter, and just as a person on the scene at a very young age. His first album in 1992 was when he was 15 years old. He has 12 albums to date. And one of the interesting parts of the story is that an album he did in 2009 featured Johnny Greenwood, who's the lead guitarist of Radiohead. And we'll see later how Radiohead figures into his story. So the story that I want to tell today about Dudu Tassa is that he's the grandson and great nephew of two great Iraqi musical artists whose names are Daoud and Salih al-Kuwaiti. They were known as the al-Kuwaiti brothers. So Daoud is Dudu Tassa's grandfather, and he plays the qanun, and you can see that figured on the screen. The qanun is I guess we would say in Western music, is a zither. It's an open string instrument, and one would pluck on both sides of the instrument with the various notes. And you see the tuning pegs there. There's a different tuning system called the maqamat, so it facilitates in their tuning system. And then his uncle Salih is Dudu Tassa's great uncle, and of course Daoud's brother, and he plays the oud. The oud is the Middle Eastern lute. And from the 1920s to the 1950s, they were, I mean, for lack of a better term, maybe the Simon and Garfunkel of Iraqi music. They really were very popular songwriters. They played all over the country. They're known for helping to develop the Iraqi orchestra. And the Iraqi orchestra, it says when the Jews immigrated to Israel in the 1950s, that the Iraqi orchestra had to close down for a short while because there were so many Jewish musicians. In different parts of the world, particularly in Iraq, Jews were the musicians for the entire country. And it's not just playing Jewish music, it's playing Iraqi music. They were part of Iraqi music and Iraqi culture. And over time, other Western instruments became a part of the ensembles. You see someone who plays the cello, the violin. They do have a particular flute, not a Western flute, that's called the nai. And Dudu Tassa reflects that growing up, that he had no idea how popular his grandfather and great uncle were. And he didn't realize this until many years later. They died when he was just a few months old. And it was later that he learned how prominent they were. And when his grandfather and great uncle moved to Israel, they owned a store, a little makolet, and just played music on the side. And here in Iraq, they were really big stars. And then they come to Israel and they're virtually nobody. So when the Kuwaitis left, their heritage and their music was suddenly changed. And in some ways, their identities were taken out of this music, and the music just became known as just Iraqi folk songs and no longer associated with them. So this project for Dudu Tassa of playing the music of his grandfather, his great uncle, is to really reclaim his heritage. So this project begins in 2001 with this recording called Dudu Tassa and the Kuwaitis. And what he does on stage, through this recording and then through his various renditions of this in concerts, is represents the music of his grandfather and great uncle. I just want to play this real quick example. First, an original recording of the Kuwaiti brothers from the 1920s, and this Arabic song called Ya Nabat al-Rena.
يا نبعات ريحان حني على الولا حني على الولا جسمي.
Part of the project for Dudu Tassa was to represent that music, and you're going to hear note for note the same song in his 2001 album, but you'll start to hear an electric bass and electric guitar. They're putting in a rock texture integrated with this music. recording takes on many forms. It takes on the forms of Dudutasa being inspired by this music and having new creations of it, to what we just heard, these sort of literal representations of it. And so he's integrating, he's really playing with the music. Arabic music has a few important features to mention. One is that there's typically always a very driving rhythm, and it's governed by a particular type of rhythmic pattern that is consistent through a particular song. And an evening of Arab music is made up of a suite of different type of song forms with different rhythms. So when you're in a song, there's a particular rhythm, and typically that rhythm is the lyrics of this text are done in conjunction with the rhythm. So you really have this propelling notion, this propelling feeling to how the music develops. So one of his songs, Wala Agibni Gamalak, I have a concert version to really share with you. And the important thing to see as you're hearing this music and visualizing it is that it's not just a matter of him taking the music as a rock artist and playing it. He's integrating the textures. He's integrating the texture of the Arabic music, and he's negotiating with it. He's really playing with it. And this represents this notion that I tried to say at the very beginning of how past and present are meeting together. So we're going to hear a little bit of it, and you'll hear the sort of main, I'm sorry?
No, I just wanted to say before we hear it, I wanted to say that it reminds me a lot of sampling in hip hop and rap, sort of calling upon an older tradition, maybe even an oral tradition, and integrating it right into your own music. And it's not copying, right? It's something much more complicated than that. So just a parallel that we might want to think about as well.
Yeah, it's a very, very good and very important observation. The one difference here is that rather than being like a moment in hip hop of just a sound bite, this is sort of an integrated texture throughout the entire song. And what you'll hear, I'll play about 2 minutes of it so you can hear this unfold. You'll hear the melody done by the string instruments, and slowly the bass and guitar and drums will come in and play that melody. Dudutasa will then sing the lyrics, and then there'll be this alternation between the sort of traditionalized sound of it and this rock sound, and you'll hear how it goes back and forth.
عجبني جمالك جمالك ولا عجبني جمالك جمالك يا بديع الجمال الجمال يا بديع الجمال الجمال ولا عجبني جمالك جمالك ولا عجبني جمالك.
So this gives you a really interesting feel for what he's trying to do with this music. And an interesting aspect of it is that there's a wonderful documentary that came out a few years ago called Iraq and Roll, which is about his experiences of learning this music and how he came to be involved in this project and how people were trying to get him connected to his family heritage. And one of the things he says about this initial recording is that he doesn't speak Arabic, he doesn't know Arabic, he learned the words. So there's a certain aspect to where the Arabic becomes a sound and not necessarily presented in a meaningful aspect that I'm singing this Arabic song. It's that he's reclaiming the heritage through the sound and really through the music. this music is, the text of this particular song talks about loving God and loving the beauty of God, and that nothing compares to God. So it's not necessarily specific to being Jewish or Islamic. It has more of a universal message. So there's a way to grab onto the message of this music, but his way into it is really through the sound. I want to play one other example, and as you hear this example, Ala Shawati, I want you to just sort of like see sort of the intimacy by which this music is really operating and the passion that he's conveying it. We'll see not only the string ensemble, but also someone playing the qanun, and you'll get a feel for the various textures of the sound.
على شواطئ دجلة مور على شواطئ دجلة مور يا منياتي وقت الفجر وقت الفجر على شواطئ دجلة مور على شواطئ دجلة مور يا منياتي وقت الفجر وقت شوفوا طبيعة زي بديعة شوف.
So you can hear how the music is very melody centric. It's really centered around the melody. And as he's playing and singing some of the other instrumentalists, it's really the same melody. Everyone sort of has their slight differences in interpretation of it. But as this goes along, there might be an echoing phrase to it. So these are sort of the dynamics of Arab music that he's really incorporating. What's fascinating to see for Dudu Tassa is that this experience he had with Johnny Greenwood led to this act, Dudu Tassa and the Kuwaitis, being the opening act for Radiohead's tour in 2017. And this started at the Coachella Festival, which is an area just east of Los Angeles. And this article really covers this particular project. So, our title of Unexpected Consequences is really intended to really explain that this is a very interesting trend in Israeli music today of popular Israeli songs now have Arabic words and Arabic titles. There are many artists, the Awa sisters, Yemenite sisters, who are really prominent, and their YouTube videos are really like intoxicating in just various different ways in the images that they have. And this is a growing trend, and to see that it's not only a trend within Israel, but also something that's sort of done for export outside of Israel. So it really has, a certain buzz to it. And I think, the Adon Rifle project, which was very popular 15 or so years ago, is similar here, because now Dudu Tassa has really done a series of albums. They just came out with a third album it was released about a year ago, done in 2018. So this has been an ongoing project for him to really restore this musical heritage. So do you want to go on to the example you
so obviously, when we originally thought about this, we listed more than one artist that signifies this. We thought about talking about Ba Ladino, which is an amazing Ladino quartet that is doing sort of similar things. We're not going to talk about them today, but I encourage you to look them up. They have amazing videos on YouTube that is reclaiming a bit of a different tradition, a more strictly Sephardic tradition coming with Andalusian music and that sort of world. The next trend that we wanted to talk about today is religious trends in Israeli music and Jewish Israeli music. You know, so when we talk about Israel and we talk about sort of changes in Israel in the past, let's say 10 or 15 years, one of the words that's used that sounds, I would say, better in Hebrew than in English is hadata, or religionization, for lack of a better term. And often it's used negatively by people who are, let's say, less thrilled than the sort of resurging role of religion in Israeli life. But it's also led to some really interesting cultural changes, right? There's been more religious content and more religious Jewish people, let's say, in cinema, in television. Well, it's happened also in music as well, where there are artists who sometimes they come from a religious background, sometimes they don't, who are popular not just in Orthodox Jewish communities, but sort of for the Israeli public as a whole. There's a pretty famous artist, some of you may know, Yishai Ribo. His song Seder Avodah, which is a part of the Yom Kippur service, became very popular, I would say, in Israel and America. A lot of these songs focus on spirituality, on faith, and the lyrics are often ambiguous, right? They could be about God, they could also be maybe about your ex that you broke up with and you miss, and I think that's part of this appeal. And today, while we're going to talk about some religious artists, there's also secular artists who have explored religious themes as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's a good reminder for us that these lines that we draw between religious and secular are not always as black and white as we may seem. So the person I actually want to spend time talking about today is a woman named Narkis. And Mark, if you could just go to the slides so we could see the picture of her. We'll play her music in a second. So Narkis, for those of you who don't know, the Hebrew word, it's the Hebrew word for narcissus, right? The flower in the Greek god. So it's quite a striking name for an Orthodox Jewish woman to have. And her music is really interesting for a variety of reasons. But one of them is in that sort of traditional Orthodox Jewish culture, there's an idea of kol isha, of a woman's voice, singing voice, not being appropriate, let's say, for the public sphere, that men should not hear women sing. And Narkis is a woman who grew up, let's say, traditional-ish, which is usually, you know, observing the Sabbath, observing holidays, but not necessarily in a strict way. She became observant after she traveled in Brazil and in India. I was reading newspaper articles about her, and one of them said, Mihodu lahodu Hashem, from India to thanking God. It's a good Hebrew pun. And she became observant. She became Orthodox, and she actually stopped playing music. She had dabbled a bit in her secular youth. She got married and became very observant, and this was a world she was cut off from. As her marriage started to crumble and as she started the divorce proceedings, she started to rediscover music. So she starts playing in only female audiences, and then eventually she has a conversation with a rabbi that she's close with, and he basically gives her permission to say, you have this special mission, you're really important, you can play for everyone. And she bursts out into the Israeli scene. She uses lots of texts, pre-existing texts. She writes some of her own. She talks a lot about nature. And for Israelis to see someone who covers their hair, as you can see, she's always wearing these huge scarves, is, I think, really striking and really different, right? Israelis are often used to seeing religious men on the stage in the public sphere. I think they're often less used to seeing religious women. And so she's constantly facing questions of, how are you allowed to do this? How are you still a religious woman? But what's more interesting to me is her music. She's often compared to Amy Winehouse or Beyonce, a sort of diva-esque, you know, sort of deeper voice that booms and can fill up a whole room. And I wanted to just play clips from two of her songs that I think really signify her music and what she's doing. And the first one, which is probably her most popular song right now, is one of these songs that could either be about God or could it be about, let's say, her ex-husband, right? There's a ambiguity there that works for her purpose and works for her needs. So I want you to think about, right, the themes of this, what this music sounds like, how it's similar or how it's different, let's say, to other Israeli music, I think this falls more under the rock genre. And yeah, just something to think about. So Mark, if you could play, I think about the first minute and 40 seconds of this, I'll give you a sign when to cut it off.
מטוסים חוצים שמיים עמוסים כמוני מנסים למצוא שבילים שאף אחד עוד לא היה בם רק לרגע תהילה שיגמר בעוד שנייה אורות קווים כולם הולכים אבל רוצים אליך רק הפעם אולי כבר נרד מהסיבוב הזה כל מה שרצינו בסוף נמצא כאן סוף דבר הכל נשמע בסוף היום אתה איתה אבל כותב שירים של מישהו שאין לו לילה איך הם אוהבים אותך רוצים לקחת חתיכה הם לא יודעים שגם אתה רוצה לחיות בשקט רק הפעם אולי כבר נרד מהסיבוב הזה כל מה שרצינו בסוף נמצא כאן אם אני לבד אז גם אתה לבד גם אתה לבד אם אני לבד אז גם אתה לבד גם אתה לבד גם אתה לבד ממה אתה בורא
All right, so I just wanted to hear a bit of the chorus, right? So as you can see, she's playing with these terms, and these ideas of trying to find meaning, of trying to find her own path. Her name is Narkis with an S at the end. She is all over Spotify, so there's some questions about finding more of her work. So sometimes she's using original lyrics, and then sometimes she's doing something really interesting, which a lot of other Israeli artists have done, and that's using older text, often forgotten text. She has a song called Aneni, Answer Me, and the song is actually written, it's actually a piyut, a sort of religious hymn that's written by someone who is named Rav Shalom Korach, or Korach. He was a Taimani poet, born in 1873, died in 1952. He is not well known, I would say, outside of Taimani Jews. I had never heard of him before. And I'm not entirely sure how she found this. Would be curious to ask her. But this is a story, much like Mark mentioned, of someone who was very popular, and a very popular rabbi in Yemen. He was lived in Sana'a and fled to Israel after 1948. And when he's in Israel, he's not well known, right? He dies a couple of years later, pretty much unknown, and his work is not, well known in Israel today. So what Narkis does with this song is she uses it as inspiration, right? And it's extremely religious, right? This is God answer me. It sounds a lot like the High Holiday liturgy that many of you may be familiar with God answering the Jews, God saving them from their prayers, and sort of helping them in this period of distress. So this also taps into this, I would say, new age spiritual wave in Israeli culture and in Israeli music in general, where Israelis are really searching for something and thinking about, what their answers are going to be, right? It's no coincidence that Narkis also went, searching in India for meaning the same way a lot of Israelis do after they finish the army. This is not something unique to Narkis. A lot of Israelis have recorded these older poems. There are some Israelis who have recorded entire albums of them. I was just thinking of Barry Sacharath, it's his birthday today. He has an entire album of these piyutim. He's a sort of quintessential Israeli rock star. So again, it's these interesting lines between religious and secular and how they play out in the public sphere. If we could go to the next slide, I want you to hear a little bit of Aneni. This is a public performance. This is Galgalot's, the sort of main Israeli music station, and she is playing the song. So what it means for her to be playing this sort of religious hymn from 100 years ago in the army station in Israel is a really interesting question, something that we can think about. Mark, I actually want you to try and go, if you could go to about 2:35, if you're able to do that, because I actually want us to hear the end of the song. I also want us to look at her presence and sort of see what this means to have this clearly religious Jewish woman in the public sphere singing. Perfect. Can you also go, I think right, it's the next slide that you have the words. I just want people to have to get a sense of the translation. So really you see here how she's taking this song, right, that is obviously using also a lot of references, has a lot of quotes from Psalms and other Jewish sources, and bringing it to a modern audience, right? If you didn't know what the words meant at all, you wouldn't necessarily guess this is a quote unquote religious poem, right? So it's really interesting, again, to see this take and to see this mix. I would say there are also parallels, right, with Dudu Tassa and this rediscovery, right, of a heritage that a lot of Israelis might have not been familiar with otherwise. We just a minute or so left before we go to questions. Mark, I wanted to see if you had anything else to add about the two trends we talked about today, sort of what they mean for Israel. I know everyone has a lot of questions, so I'm excited to see those as well.
So thank you. That's just a wonderful presentation on Narkis. Just a couple of observations about that is that there's a certain level, at least the first song that you wanted to play, where the Mizrahi sound, and I hate to be like a one-track record, so to speak, about Mizrahi music, but the Mizrahi sound is like just a part of the landscape of sound. It's something that's just being pulled in, and even if it's a moment, or sometimes it's integrated, but it's there, with her. If people get a chance to see that whole clip that you played, one thing that I really love about it is that it has this great feeling of spontaneity, and almost like an alt rock feel to it, where it's just like really like in the moment, just really expressing the music, and a lot of her vocal expressions really come from a more male-dominated, sound world that she's using and adapting for a female voice. And I mean, those are really important things to really see in, in different forms of Middle Eastern music, is how, gender stereotype representative certain things are, that then get renegotiated and then get used in different ways. I think what really strikes me about her music is how she's really telling a story with what she's singing. It's really, really coming from the heart. And I think that this like personal narrative of telling a story, even if it's religious words or the different ways that you frame that ambiguity, is so much a part of Israeli rock music, or where Israeli music is really at, that it's, I mean, maybe we could say in American music, it's a lot like what the blues is. You know, the blues is about, I know the truth, I'm going to tell you the truth. So there's this real sense of reality. I'm giving to reality. It's just a real personal, emotive moment that then people can really, you know, really latch onto.
Right. So I think that's a perfect point for us to pass over to questions. I keep the questions coming. I know that there are a ton coming in. And Jonathan, I am thrilled to hand it over for you to handle the questions.
Me start my video. Here we go. All right. First of all, let me join everyone in thanking Mark and Shayna. There were lots of interesting questions. Some of them were people looking for comparisons. For example, the question was raised by Professor Josh Jacobson as to the extent that we can see influence from earlier Yemenite development, someone like Ofra Chazah, who took traditional Yemenite elements, brought them into Israeli music, and to what extent are later Israeli musicians really building on those Yemenite pioneers. Mark, I don't know, or Shayna, I don't know if any of you want to comment.
Yeah. So I'd be happy to say a few comments. I'm sure Shayna has wonderful things to say too. That's just a great comment that Josh Jacobson has, and a beautiful question. You know, as we all know, Yemenite culture is sort of the prototype culture that you know, Israeli pioneers are looking towards representing, and the way in which to do a new modern thing is to take what Yemenites do. And you know, as we all know from Israeli dancing, you know, just the Yemenite right, the Yemenite left, you know, foods. So much of Israeli culture, you know, stems out of that. And even before Ofra Haza, there's this great experience of Bracha Zafira, who's a Yemenite orphan, who is learning how to learn Western music, and works with Nachum Nardi and also Paul Ben Chaim. And Paul Ben Chaim's early art songs of Israeli music are really drawing from Yemenite music. So this is a trope that now we can say maybe it probably goes back almost 100 years and is sort of been ongoing. And a lot of contemporary Israeli composers today are still drawing from Yemenite music. So that Yemenite well is just really, really deep. And it's something that's ongoing, as we see with Narkis, and you know, there are many, many others from Ofra Haza to Narkis. I don't know if people are familiar with Medad Tassa, who is this, you know, young boy Yemenite singer that sang out of the Yemenite heritage. But what's interesting to mention is that really through the Kehilot Sharot project and the whole project that Shayna mentioned about the public singing of Piyutim, is that there was really this desire to sort of broaden, you know, the source material and go beyond the Yemenite community. So David Buzaglo, a very well-known North African rabbi in Paitan, his music becomes very important. And there are dozens and dozens of other names of North African, Iraqi, and many, many different traditions. So I think the Yemenite may be the most well-known, and the most well-known in at least outside of Israel is sort of a sense of export, but the trend is is just very, very, very deep with many other traditions as well.
So we have a couple of questions that aim to move us from the Mizrahi world back to the European world, and are really asking about European influence. There is a question about the impact of Eurovision on Israeli music. Israelis are mad about Eurovision and indeed very excited about winning it. Similarly, somebody pointed out that of Israel's top 50, 20 of them have English lyrics, 19 of them by non-Israelis. So the question really is, what about this other side that we haven't talked about today, the European, the international influence, and whether you can say a few words about that.
So Shayna, do you want to start with
Right. So, I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I love thinking about Eurovision. So I think the important thing to realize about Eurovision is that it is, to some extent, marketing. And by that, I mean, it's how Israel wants to represent itself to the world. So there's a self-consciousness there, right? What's the message that we're sending? So it's not just about the song, it's also about the artist, who they represent, and what they represent, right? And of course, that's changed over time, right? When Netta was sent to Eurovision, right, her message was about girl power, right, about accepting yourself no matter who you were, and that Israel could represent that sort of diversity. Also, what's interesting about Eurovision is that it's not so European anymore, that we see within Eurovision, right, a lot of diversity, a lot of influence from places outside of Europe that make their way in. And that, of course, shows up in the Israeli entries as well, right? Netta is hugely influenced by K-pop, right? Korean popular music. And, you know, someone asked about language and whatnot. As for Eurovision, it represents, and what we see is the globalization of Israeli music, right? You can pull from here, you can pull from there, and you can put things together in an interesting way that we haven't necessarily seen before. Mark, is there anything you want to add to that, you know, about Eurovision and Israeli music and whatnot?
Just two very quick things. One is that if you look at the other finalists in the last few years of Eurovision, you find that the, you know, Irish, Polish, you know, Turkish entries are also laden with English as well. Yes. So it's not just Israelis, you know, taking on English. It's a world trend as well. And there is this sense of, like, you know, global music, and no one is sort of like, you know, taking ownership of any particular sounds, and there's this global sound. The only other thing that I think is worth mentioning on this level of Israeli music is that there is a large American influence as well. And hip hop and rap is, you know, we should just do a session just on that in Israeli music, and how African American tropes and ideas are being utilized as well, which is quite fascinating, that it's not just appropriating sound, but also iconography and very important cultural messages.
So
right, and in different ways, and I'll just, and in different ways, right? What rap looks like, let's say, in the Ethiopian Israeli community is very different than, say, how Israeli Palestinians use rap. So it's a really interesting topic, and for another seminar. Jonathan.
Since you mentioned the Palestinian community, one of the questions we have from Dan Gruen is, how is this use, especially of Arabic by Dudu Tassa, really viewed by Arab citizens? How is it viewed in the Palestinian community? That's one question. And a related question, how has all this impacted upon relations among Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Mizrahim, all the different tribes of Israel that we hear about? So two big questions about music's impact.
So So I'll take an initial stab, just tell you a little more about Dudu Tassa's connection to it, and I know Shayna has a lot to say on this too. Dudu Tassa said in an interview something quite fascinating, which is that we don't have dialogues with each other, meaning Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians, but our music is a shared heritage. And we don't need Dudu Tassa to say that. That's something that we know. But I think that that's what he wants to communicate regarding the music that he's trying to sing, is that this is his way of trying to have a broader and bigger appeal. And from what we could see in trade magazines and different representations in the media, is that certainly this music is very well listened to by Arabs and Palestinians. And that's something that's been going on for decades. I mean, Amy Horowitz shows in her book, and many other people have discussed that, Daklan, I mean, some of the real tried and true and well-known Mizrahi artists have had huge followings throughout the Arab-speaking world. So it really gets to this aspect that music is really universal. David McCullough of Indiana University has written a book a few years ago, particularly about the Palestinian music that's really been created and how this dialogue is developing from the Palestinian end.
Did you want to go on? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add that Palestinian music, of course, is they're Israeli Palestinians or dialogue with Palestinians in the West Bank. There's also a huge alternative music scene coming out of Beirut, in which a lot of Palestinian artists are involved. And I would also say one of the things that's interesting that's developed over the past couple of years is Israeli Palestinian artists who make their way into the Mizrahi music scene, which has been seen as sort of as Jewish, right? And the most interesting artist who's done that is someone named Nasreen, or I think the most interesting. She became famous when she won Eyal Golan, who's a very famous, problematic, leave that aside for today, Israeli musician, who had his own Mizrahi music show. She became a hugely popular Israeli Arab singer. She actually ends up converting to Judaism and talks about her Jewish journey and whatnot, and is now hugely popular, right? So again, it's coming from both directions, and it's really interesting to see that. And just to add, as someone who's watched a lot of Dudu Tassa YouTube videos over the past couple of days, you see dozens of comments from Iraqis saying, we miss you, this is wrong, you're part of us too, etc. So, it's interesting to see that.
So Ellen Messer asks if we can return to the title of Hotel Corona and asks, how does this music bring all kinds of Israelis, Sfaradim, Ashkenazim, Arab Israelis, how does it bring them all together to share sentiments and human experience through music? So you can tell us more about the musical aspect of Hotel Corona.
Shayna, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think obviously this unfortunately isn't going on now, but music festivals in Israel are huge. And I think the common experience of Israelis going on doing music festivals and hearing different kinds of music. I will also add that, I mentioned Galgalatz, the biggest radio station in Israel, which is a military radio station. It's actually run by the army. There are constant debates about what is played on Galgalatz, when it's played on Galgalatz, who gets the most airtime, right? Because the station is owned by the government, it's not just a creative discussion, it also becomes a political discussion. So it's really interesting to see those. I will say that a lot of people are listening to different kinds of music that they wouldn't have been exposed to, right? We mentioned Mizrahi music. One of the things that was called in its infancy, or it was bus station music, because to listen to this music, you had to go to the central bus station in Tel Aviv and buy poorly made cassettes. And that was the only way you could get it. It was not played on the radio. It was not part of the sort of mainstream musical establishment in Israel, which was still dominated, right, by the Ashkenazi elite. So now it's much easier to listen to this kind of music, to hear different kinds of culture, right? The question is, as I think Mark alluded to earlier, what's the next step after that, right? If I like Iraqi music, does that change how I behave, right, in my day-to-day life? Does that change how I vote? I don't know, but it's an interesting question.
I think that the other aspect of this is how there have been fascinating collaborations between Mizrahi artists and rock artists. And this Piyut project is one example, but just how a group like Ethniques, suddenly, after hearing, God, why am I blanking on her name? A female singer of Egyptian music. She did recordings.
Not Umkaltum. No, more common. We'll remember later.
Oh, right. Sorry, suddenly forgot her name. But there's just this aspect of how established, rock artists in Israel in the 90s, throughout the 2000s, would do these incredible musical collaborations. And it seems to be that Mizrahi sort of like rock divide is almost obliterated now, where those identities are kind of less significant, as identities and sound worlds are more closely aligned. So to really answer the question that you're asking, Jonathan, I mean, I'm not aware of any particular studies that people have done, and it would really be great to see more of these, ethnographies that people might be able to do to really see how that's all, enacting. And I mean, I don't know if people have really done studies of what music is done at various political rallies in Israel, but that would also be a really fascinating, interconnection as well.
So someone asks about audience. What does it really mean when we talk about rock stars? What are we talking about in terms of sales? Give us a sense of the audiences, Shayna or Mark, do you know?
So,
well, the whole economy of Israeli rock music, and this is something I'm not, a scholar of, and just what people have really represented in the literature, is that, no one really lives a lavish rock star style in Israel, from what I can see, because the market isn't that big. And what happens is that I think for many artists, you really have that difficulty of, if you really want to make it big, you have to leave Israel. Then if you leave Israel, are you still an Israeli artist? And this is something that often happens with trying to assess Ofra Haza, in the sense that she was huge in Israel. I mean, she was a part of Ashiri Eretz Yisrael. She was a part of so many things, and she was really one of the first, not only from Israel, but just in general, to be part of Columbia Records World Beat Ethnopop recording, and then becomes a recording artist in Europe and America, working in various studios. And it seems that if you want to kind of make your riches, you want to leave Israel, but then what then happens to your identity? So I think within Israel, it's more of a local, it's more akin, like in America, to a local hero. So to where the local hero makes good in a larger arena.
So final couple of words. What's going on today? Do either of you have a sense the music industry's more or less being shut down? Any thoughts on the impact of this going forward, Shayna?
Right. So, as some of you may be aware, Israel has entered sort of a re-shutdown, right? They've shut down everything again after a period of some opening. There is, as Mark said, this is not a wealthy industry, right? This is not an area where people are getting extremely wealthy. And there is a call for artists, or from artists, I should say, for support from the government, saying, if you want us to continue to be able as working on artists, we need your help and we need your support, the same way there's been support for other industries. As we talked about before, unlike the United States, there's a much stronger identification between the arts and the state in a different sort of way. So I hope, I mean, this is my own personal opinion, I hope that Israel and the government will see the importance of the arts and do something to continue these people to keep creating music and culture.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we've had a most enjoyable, illuminating, exciting program. I can see from the chat and the questions that this is a subject people want us to return to. And indeed, it's not been, I think, sufficiently explored within Israel studies. I apologize if we haven't gotten to every question, but there'll be other opportunities. Please join us again in 2 weeks for the last of our 4-part series. We will be exploring the economy of Israel and how it has been impacted by the coronavirus. Thank you, and please tell your friends to join us in 2 weeks. Have a good day.